Okay, let's get some analysis on this, and for that we're joined by Dr. William Lawrence. He is a professor of political science and international affairs at American University. Doctor, thanks very much for taking some time this weekend to chat with us. We've heard Israel and the United States say over and again they believe the fighting can be contained to Gaza, but you hear the report coming from the Associated Press there, also Gaza, which of course West Bank, which predated the fighting in Gaza, but concerns about the ongoing conflict going up in the border with Lebanon. How concerned are you that this is going to spread?
It already spread from day one. There's been fighting along the Lebanese border since October 7th. There's been shelling towards the Golan Heights back and forth since the day or two after October 7th. There's been strikes back and forth in Syria and Iraq, the missile intercepts coming from Yemen, even bombs dropping on the northern Egyptian territory. So to say there's a fear of an escalation that hasn't happened yet is to misdescribe it. I think what that language should say is that there's a fear of an all-out war between Lebanon and Israel, like 2006, where Israel re-invades Lebanon to push Hezbollah back and out, or an all-out conflict towards American troops in Syria and Iraq that involves, major mobilizations of U.S. troops, the mobilization of the weapons on the U.S. carrier groups in the Eastern Mediterranean, et cetera, et cetera. So the escalation's already happened. It's containing the existing escalation that we're talking about.
Okay, Dr. Lawrence, the U.S. Is Israel's greatest ally, pushing for at least a prolonged humanitarian pause in the fighting. But Prime Minister Netanyahu remains firm, no deal, until all hostages are freed. At the same time, Israel saying today it doesn't know how many of the hostages are still alive. Your thoughts on that whole situation?
That's just a lot of verbiage without much meaning. I mean, we know there's about 180 hostages being held by Hamas, another 40 by Islamic Jihad, another 20 by independent Palestinians. In terms of the killing of hostages by the bombing, we've seen various figures, and there's been at least 20 killed by the bombing, and of course one was rescued and 4 were released. And I think there are about 9 nationalities of hostages. But the idea that there isn't a ceasefire until all the hostages are released is sort of an absurd idea, because that's not what the hostage negotiations are about. The current hostage negotiation, which Israel's not engaged in but will sign on to if it's successful, is a release of about 80 women and children being held by Hamas and its allies in exchange for 80 women and children being released from Israeli prisons. There's about 1,200 Palestinians being held without charges in Israeli prisons, of a total of about 7,000, and it's the women and children, civilians, that would be exchanged first.
There are protests almost daily somewhere in the world on this conflict. Meanwhile, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan saying sources indicate Hamas is using hospitals and other public buildings for command centers, with the EU backing that up by saying Hamas is also using civilians as human shields. If that is true, is there any reason to believe that Israel will show restraint moving forward?
Well, first of all, let me say that it doesn't matter under international humanitarian law. You have to leave the hospitals alone. I mean, you might be able to do something surgical, but we've seen very little surgically from the Israelis. In terms of the human shield things, that's another sort of red herring, because Palestinians don't want to leave. 60% of Gazans are the descendants of those evicted in 48 and 67. They don't want to go anywhere, although
there's also the belief, where do they go? I mean, we've heard that over and over.
Yeah, exactly. 1.5 million are sequestering in the South, and the South is being bombed. And some days the South has gotten more bombs than the North has. So these are all sort of disingenuous talking points. In terms of Israel restraining itself, there's a glimmer of hope there. And not by huge effort that's apparent to everyone, but for example, once the Israeli ground troops went into the north, there was less bombing where they were, so that there wouldn't be bombing by friendly fire. Troops on the ground can be more discriminating. They tend to be more discriminating in terms of who they shoot, as we see, for example, in the West Bank, where the killing is much less. And so, but the most important thing is that Israel agreed to these 4-hour pauses. The current hostage negotiation includes a 1 or 2 or 3 day ceasefire attached to it. And advisors from the U.S. who worked in Mosul, which was very surgical, have been advising the Israelis on better tactics than what they have now.
Okay. Dr. Lawrence, thank you so much for